Have you ever found yourself wondering if what he feels for you is actually real? Not because of what he says, but because of how it feels. Because sometimes it feels warm, safe, certain, and other times it feels distant, unclear, like something is missing, but you can't quite explain what. And that's the hardest part, isn't it? Not knowing. Not being able to tell if you're overthinking. Or finally seeing the truth. You replay conversations in your mind. You analyze small changes in his tone. You notice when something feels off. But then you question yourself. Maybe I'm just being too sensitive. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe this is just how relationships are. But deep down, there's a quiet feeling that doesn't go away. A feeling that asks, if this is real, why does it feel uncertain? Because real things shouldn't feel confusing. And yet, here you are, trying to understand something that shouldn't need this much effort. Trying to read between lines that shouldn't even exist. And the more you try to figure it out, the more complicated it becomes. Some days, he makes you feel important. Other days, you feel like an option. And that contrast creates something heavy. Not loud. Not dramatic. But constant. A kind of emotional tension that you carry quietly. You don't always talk about it. But it's there. In the pauses. In the silence. In the moments where you wonder if you're the only one thinking this deeply. And maybe the real question isn't, does he love me? Maybe the real question is, why can't I feel it consistently? Because love, if it's real, shouldn't feel like something you have to keep proving to yourself. And yet, something keeps pulling you back into doubt. Something keeps making you question what should feel certain. And that's where everything begins. Not in what he says. Not in what he promises. But in what you feel. When everything becomes quiet. Before anything else. You need to hear this clearly. This is not your fault. The confusion you feel. The overthinking. The constant need to understand what's really going on. None of that means you're too much. And it definitely doesn't mean you're asking for something unrealistic. It simply means you care. And when you care, you pay attention. You notice shifts. You feel changes. You pick up on things that others might ignore. That's not a weakness. That's awareness. But here's where it becomes difficult. You were never taught how to trust that awareness. Instead, you were taught to question it. To second-guess your feelings. To minimize what you sense. To convince yourself that maybe you're just imagining things. So when something feels off, you don't immediately trust it. You analyze it. You explain it away. You try to be understanding. And slowly, you start disconnecting from your own clarity. Because it feels safer to doubt yourself than to face the possibility that something isn't right. And that's where the cycle begins. You feel something. You question it. You silence it. And then, it comes back stronger. Not because you're overthinking, but because something inside you is still trying to be heard. And the more you ignore it, the louder it becomes. This is why it feels so exhausting. Not because of him, but because of the constant conversation happening inside your mind. One part of you says, everything is fine. Don't overreact. And another part quietly asks, then why doesn't it feel stable? And you get stuck between those two voices, trying to stay calm, while something inside you refuses to settle. But here's the truth most people don't say. You were never meant to feel confused in something that is real. You were never meant to constantly guess where you stand. You were never meant to search for clarity in someone else's behavior. Real emotional connection doesn't require that kind of effort. It doesn't create constant uncertainty. It doesn't leave you wondering if you matter. And if that feels hard to accept, it's only because you've been taught to normalize confusion. You've been told that love is complicated, that it's supposed to be difficult, that it naturally comes with doubt. But that's not entirely true. Yes, relationships can have challenges. Yes, people are imperfect. But confusion is not the foundation of something real. It's usually a signal that something isn't aligned. And instead of trusting that signal, most people try to manage it. They try to become more patient, more understanding, less emotional. They adjust themselves in hopes that things will feel clearer. But clarity doesn't come from adjusting yourself to fit uncertainty. Clarity comes from recognizing what shouldn't feel uncertain in the first place. And that's where your power actually is. Not in trying harder. Not in figuring him out. But in understanding your own response. Because the truth is, you don't need to chase clarity. You don't need to earn consistency. And you definitely don't need to convince yourself. That confusion is normal. What you're feeling right now makes sense. It's valid. And more importantly, it's pointing you towards something important. Not about him. About truth. Because when something is real, your mind doesn't have to work this hard to understand it. Your heart doesn't have to keep checking. And your emotions don't feel like they're on a constant loop. There's a difference between depth and instability, between emotional intensity and emotional security. And if no one has ever explained that to you before, then of course this feels confusing. Of course you're trying to make sense of it. Of course you're wondering if maybe you're expecting too much. But you're not. You're simply recognizing that something doesn't feel consistent. And instead of trusting that recognition, you've been trying to solve it. But maybe it was never something to solve. Maybe it was something to understand. And once you begin to see that, something inside you starts to shift. You stop blaming yourself. You stop forcing explanations. You stop trying to make uncertainty feel normal. And instead, you begin to pay attention in a different way. Not through overthinking, but through awareness. Because the goal was never to figure him out. The goal was always to understand what real clarity actually feels like. And once you experience that, you'll never confuse it again. Most people think they understand what love looks like. They believe it's about effort, about attention, about how much someone shows they care. And because of that, they start measuring love in very specific ways. How often he texts. How much time he gives. How intense his words are. How strongly he expresses his feelings. And at first, those things feel convincing. They feel like proof. Because intensity can feel powerful. Attention can feel reassuring. And words can sound exactly like what you've been wanting to hear. But here's where the misunderstanding begins. Intensity is not stability. Attention is not consistency. And words are not always truth. Yet most people build their understanding of love around those things. So when they receive them, they feel secure. And when those things change, they feel uncertain. That's why the experience becomes so confusing. Because the signs you've been taught to look for are constantly shifting. One day, everything feels strong. The next, something feels different. And you don't know why. So naturally. You try to adjust. You become more patient. More understanding. More flexible. You tell yourself. Maybe he's just busy. Maybe he's going through something. Maybe I just need to give it time. And sometimes, that's true. But other times, those explanations become a way of avoiding a deeper realization. Because the real issue isn't what he says. It's not even what he does occasionally. It's what remains consistent. Without effort. That's the part most people don't pay attention to. They focus on moments. But real connection is not built on moments. It's revealed through patterns. And patterns don't lie. They don't depend on mood. They don't change based on convenience. They don't appear only when it's easy. They are steady. And if something is real, it doesn't disappear when things become uncomfortable. It doesn't fade when effort is required. It doesn't become unclear the moment situations change. But most people aren't taught to observe patterns. They're taught to react to moments. So when something feels good, they hold on to it. And when something feels off, they try to fix it. Back and forth. Up and down. Always adjusting. But never actually understanding what's happening. And that creates emotional instability. Not because the connection is deep, but because it's inconsistent. And inconsistency can feel very similar to intensity. That's why it's so easy to confuse the two. Because when something is unpredictable, it keeps your attention. It keeps you thinking. It keeps you trying to figure it out. And that constant engagement can feel like emotional depth. But it's not. It's uncertainty. And uncertainty creates attachment. Not because something is strong, but because something is unresolved. That's the part most people never realize. They think they're holding on to love, when in reality, they're holding on to confusion. Trying to turn it into something stable. Trying to make it make sense. Trying to bring clarity into something that was never clear to begin with. And the more they try, the more exhausting it becomes. Because they're investing energy into something that doesn't have a stable foundation. And no matter how much effort they give, they can't create stability from inconsistency. That's why nothing fully settles. That's why the questions keep returning. That's why even the good moments don't feel completely secure. Because deep down, something still feels uncertain. And instead of trusting that feeling, most people override it. They focus on potential. On what it could become. On what he might feel. On what things might turn into, with time. But potential is not reality. And building emotional security on potential will always lead to instability. Because you're not responding to what is. You're responding to what you hope it becomes. And hope, without clarity, creates emotional tension. That quiet tension you feel is not random. It's not you being too sensitive. It's the result of trying to find stability in something that hasn't shown it consistently. And once you understand that, something important shifts. You stop measuring love by intensity. You stop relying on words. You stop holding on to isolated moments. And you begin to see something more clearly. Love is not proven by how strong it feels sometimes. It's revealed by how stable it remains, over time. And until that becomes clear, everything else will continue to feel uncertain. Not because you don't understand love, but because you've been taught to look for it in the wrong places. There is a deeper principle at work in every relationship. Quiet, invisible, but always active. And once you understand it, you stop trying to decode people and start understanding what truly drives their behavior. Because here's the truth. People don't act from what they say. They don't even act from what they consciously think. They act from what they believe to be true internally. Automatically. Consistently. Without effort. This is something Joseph Murphy spoke about in a very clear way. He explained that the subconscious mind does not respond to words. It responds to belief. To what is accepted as truth, deep within. And once something is accepted internally, it expresses itself externally through behavior, decisions, and patterns. Not occasionally, but consistently. That's the key. Because anyone can say something. Anyone can express emotion in a moment. Anyone can create intensity when they feel like it. But no one can consistently act against their subconscious belief. It's not possible. Because the subconscious mind always seeks alignment. It always brings behavior back to what is internally true. So if someone's internal belief is stable, their actions will be stable. If their internal belief is uncertain, their actions will reflect that uncertainty. Not sometimes. Repeatedly. And this is where everything begins to make sense. Because instead of focusing on what someone says, you begin to observe what they consistently express without effort. That's where the truth is. Not in words. Not in promises. Not in temporary intensity. But in patterns that repeat. Even when there's no pressure to perform. Because those patterns are not being created. They're being revealed. They come from what is already established internally. And this is why trying to analyze someone's words will always lead to confusion. Because words can be shaped. They can be influenced by emotion, by mood, by situation. But subconscious patterns cannot. They are automatic. And they always move in the same direction. So if someone truly holds a stable, genuine feeling, it will show up in a stable, consistent way. Without needing reminders. Without needing effort. Without needing to be questioned. It will simply be there. And that kind of expression is different. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't disappear when things become inconvenient. It doesn't need to be turned on. It remains. Quietly. Naturally. Consistently. Because it's not being forced. It's being expressed. This is why Joseph Murphy emphasized something very important. The subconscious mind is consistent with what it accepts as true. And when you apply that to relationships, you begin to see something most people miss. You stop asking, "What is he saying?" And you start asking, "What is he consistently showing, without trying?" Because that answer comes directly from his internal belief. Not from intention. Not from desire. But from truth. And truth doesn't need effort to be expressed. It flows naturally. It shows up repeatedly. It doesn't need to be proven. It reveals itself over time. So when you understand this principle, you stop chasing clarity through conversation. You stop trying to figure him out. You stop analyzing every word. And instead, you observe something much more reliable. Consistency. Because consistency is not created by effort. It is produced by alignment. And alignment comes from belief. That's the hidden structure behind everything. The unseen foundation. The quiet law that explains why some connections feel stable and others don't. And once you start seeing it, you realize something very important. You don't need to search for answers. You just need to recognize what is already being shown. Because the subconscious never hides. It expresses. And it does so through patterns that don't change. So now, everything comes down to this. Not what he says. Not what he promises. Not even what he feels in certain moments. But what he does. Consistently. This is where the answer becomes clear. If he brings emotional stability into your life, his love for you is real. Not intensity. Not occasional effort. Not moments that feel powerful and then disappear. Stability. The kind you don't have to question. The kind that doesn't change depending on his mood. Or the situation. Or how convenient it is. Because real love does not create confusion. It creates clarity. And that clarity shows up in very specific ways. You don't feel like you have to guess where you stand. You don't feel like you need to analyze his behavior. You don't feel like you have to wait and see if he will show up the same way tomorrow. Because he already does. Consistently. And that consistency is not something he forces. It's something that comes naturally to him. That's the difference. When love is real, it doesn't require effort to be stable. It doesn't need reminders. It doesn't need pressure. It doesn't need to be questioned into existence. It simply remains. Even in small things. The way he responds. The way he communicates. The way he shows up, even when nothing is expected. There's a steadiness to it. A quiet reliability. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. But present. And that presence is what creates emotional safety. Because you're not constantly adjusting. You're not trying to figure things out. You're not preparing yourself for the possibility that something might change. You feel settled. Not because everything is perfect, but because it's consistent. And consistency removes doubt. That's the key. Real love doesn't eliminate challenges, but it removes confusion. You might face difficulties. You might have disagreements. But you're not questioning the foundation. You're not wondering if it's real. Because it feels stable. Even when things aren't perfect. And that's how you know. Not through grand gestures. Not through intense moments. But through the absence of emotional instability. Because when something is real, it doesn't create a constant need for reassurance. It creates quiet confidence. The kind you don't have to think about. The kind that just exists. And once you experience that, you begin to recognize something important. You've been taught to look for love in what is loud. In what is expressive. In what feels exciting. But real love is not loud. It's steady. It doesn't pull you in and push you away. It doesn't make you feel important one day and uncertain the next. It doesn't require you to keep checking. It doesn't create emotional highs and lows. Because that's not stability. That's inconsistency. And inconsistency, no matter how intense it feels, is not a sign of something real. So the question is no longer, does he say the right things? Does he show emotion sometimes? Does it feel strong in certain moments? The real question is, does it remain steady, without effort? Because that's what reveals truth. Not what happens occasionally, but what continues, naturally. And if you find yourself feeling calm, clear, and secure, without needing to overthink, that's not something small. That's not something to ignore. That's the sign. Because real love doesn't leave you searching. It doesn't leave you wondering. It doesn't leave you trying to understand it. It allows you to feel it. Without confusion. And that feeling is not created by intensity. It's created by stability. So if he brings that into your life, not sometimes, but consistently, then you don't need more proof. You don't need more signs. You don't need to keep asking, Because the answer is already there. Clear. Quiet. And undeniable. A woman once told me something that stayed with me. She said, "I don't understand it, he tells me he loves me, but I still feel unsure." And when she said that, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from being tired of questioning something. That should feel clear. So I asked her a simple question. When do you feel the most certain about him? She paused for a moment. Then she said, "When he's with me, everything feels perfect." And then I asked, "And when he's not?" She didn't answer immediately. But her silence said everything. Because that's where the truth usually is. Not in the moments when everything feels good. But in the space in between. Over time, she started noticing something. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that his presence was inconsistent. When he was there, he was fully there. Attentive. Warm. Expressive. But when he wasn't, there was a distance. Not just physical. Emotional. And that gap created uncertainty. So even though the moments were strong, the overall experience was unstable. And that instability is what she was feeling. Not a lack of intensity. A lack of consistency. Now contrast that with another situation. A different woman described her relationship very differently. She didn't talk about big gestures. She didn't mention dramatic moments. Instead, she said something simple. "I just feel calm. No confusion. No overthinking. No emotional highs and lows. Just calm." And when you asked her why, she didn't list reasons. She didn't analyze his behavior. She just said, "He's the same every day. The way he spoke. The way he showed up. The way he responded. It didn't change depending on the situation. It didn't disappear when things became difficult. It remained. And because of that, she never had to question anything. Not because she was ignoring problems, but because the foundation was stable. And stability creates clarity without effort. There was also a man who shared his experience from the other side. He said that when he truly loved someone, he didn't feel confused. Not about his feelings. Not about his actions. He didn't need to think about whether he should reach out. He didn't question whether he should be present. It wasn't something he had to decide each day. It was natural. Consistent. He showed up the same way. Because that's how he felt internally. And when I asked him what changed when he didn't feel that way, his answer was immediate. Inconsistency. Not because he wanted to be confusing, but because his internal state wasn't stable. So his behavior reflected that. And that's the part many people overlook. They assume inconsistency is a choice. But often, it's a reflection. A reflection of what someone truly feels. At a deeper level. Another story. Someone spent months trying to understand a relationship that felt unclear. They kept looking for patterns in words. Trying to find meaning in conversations. Trying to interpret signals. But every answer led to more questions. Until one day, they stopped analyzing. And instead, they asked themselves, "How do I feel, consistently? Not in the best moments. Not in the worst. But overall." And the answer was simple. Uncertain. That was the pattern. Not his words. Not his actions in isolated moments. But the overall feeling of uncertainty. And once that became clear, everything else made sense. Because the truth wasn't hidden. It was already being experienced. It just wasn't being recognized. These stories are different. Different people. Different situations. But the pattern is always the same. When something is real, it feels stable. Not perfect. Not intense all the time. But steady. And when something is not fully aligned, it feels inconsistent. No matter how strong certain moments may be. Because moments can be created. But consistency comes from truth. And truth doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't appear only when it's convenient. It doesn't require effort to maintain. It simply expresses itself. Over and over again. So when you look at your own situation, the answer isn't in the highlights. It's in the pattern. What repeats? Without effort. What remains? Over time. Because that's where real love shows itself. Not in what is said once, but in what is lived. Consistently. So now the question becomes simple. What do you do with this? Not in theory. Not just as something you understand. But in real life. In the moments where you feel uncertain. In the moments where your mind starts overthinking again. In the moments where you're tempted to go back into confusion. Because this is where everything either changes or repeats. The first step is awareness. Not of him. Of yourself. Of what you're responding to. When you feel that familiar tension, pause. Not to analyze him, but to notice your own state. Are you reacting to a moment? Or are you observing a pattern? Because those are very different things. Moments can be misleading. Patterns are not. So instead of asking, what did he mean by that? Why did he say this? Why is he acting different today? Shift your attention. Ask something deeper. What has been consistent over time? And be honest with the answer. Not hopeful. Not emotional. Clear. Because clarity doesn't come from what you want to see. It comes from what is actually there. The second step is this. Stop chasing reassurance. This is one of the biggest traps. When something feels unclear, the natural reaction is to seek confirmation. To ask more questions. To look for more signs. To wait for him to prove something. But here's the truth. If something is real, it doesn't need to be constantly confirmed. It shows itself. Naturally. Repeatedly. Without pressure. So the more you feel the need to check, the more you should pause. Because that need itself is already telling you something. Clarity doesn't create urgency. It creates calm. The third step. Observe how you feel, consistently. Not just in the good moments. Not just when he's present. But overall. When things are quiet. When you're alone. When you're not distracted by his attention. Do you feel stable? Or do you feel like you're waiting? Waiting for a message. Waiting for reassurance. Waiting for things to feel clear again. Because waiting is not the feeling of something real. Real connection doesn't leave you in a constant state of anticipation. It gives you a sense of knowing. Even in silence. And that's the difference. Now here's where the deeper shift happens. You stop trying to define love by what you receive. And start recognizing it by what remains. You stop focusing on moments. And start paying attention to consistency. You stop asking for clarity. And start noticing whether it already exists. And once you begin to see that clearly, something inside you changes. You become less reactive. Less emotional in the unstable sense. Not because you don't care. But because you understand. You understand that real love doesn't need to be chased. It doesn't need to be figured out. It doesn't need to be held together. It either exists, or it doesn't. And if it exists, you will feel it. Consistently. Without effort. And that realization changes how you move. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop adjusting to fit uncertainty. You stop trying to earn something that should be natural. Instead, you become selective. Not in a harsh way. Not in a defensive way. But in a clear way. You begin to recognize quickly what feels stable and what doesn't. What aligns and what doesn't. And you trust that recognition. You don't override it. You don't silence it. You don't convince yourself to ignore it. Because now, you understand what it means. And that understanding creates something powerful. Self-respect. Not loud. Not forced. But steady. You no longer settle for confusion. Just because there are good moments. You no longer hold on to potential. When reality is inconsistent. You no longer stay in situations that require you to question your worth. Because you've seen the difference. You've felt the difference. And once you feel what real stability is like, you can't go back to uncertainty and call it love. That's the shift. You don't become someone who searches for love. You become someone who recognizes it instantly. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not waiting to be chosen. You're not hoping it becomes real. You're not trying to turn inconsistency into something stable. You're observing. You're deciding. You're choosing. From clarity. From awareness. From understanding. And that's where your power is. Not in making someone love you, but in recognizing when it's real. Because you were never meant to convince someone to be consistent. You were meant to notice when they already are. And once you live from that place, everything becomes simpler, clearer, quieter. Because you're no longer chasing answers. You're seeing them. And that's when everything finally settles. Not because something changed outside of you, but because something became clear within you.